Welcome back to Questing Beast, everyone. I'm Ben, and today I'm very excited to have two awesome guests with me today. I have Mike Pondsmith, creator of Cyberpunk Red and Cyberpunk 2020 originally, as well as Sean McCoy, creator of Mothership, and some of the adventures that go along with Mothership as well. So super stoked to have both of you here with me to talk about science fiction, cyberpunk, and everything related to that. Before we get started, though, I'll let you introduce yourselves and just talk about what's going on with you in the gaming world. Mike, do you want to go first?
Shucks. I was going to show back to Sean there. Okay, yeah, my name's Mike Pondsmith, and yes, I'm the guy who killed your cyberpunk character, which is tradition. So primarily what I do these days is I develop two lines that we operate on at our Talsorian Games, a game company, primarily tabletop, that I've had for about 35 years, I guess. Long enough for my son to start off non-existent and now be the general manager of, as well as one of the designers. So I guess we're going to be around for a while. I'm pretty much known for having developed a game called Cyberpunk 2020. I actually wrote in Cyberpunk 2013, but that's another story. And recently we have also, besides releasing the brand new Cyberpunk Red, which is an extension of the original cyberpunk world with a lot more changes and so forth like that. We've also been tied together with Cyberpunk 2077, a video game done by our partners over in Poland, CD Projekt Red. So for the most part, we've been working too hard and trying to catch up on our sleep.
I'm Sean McCoy. I co-founded a company called Tuesday Night Games with my partner Alan Girding. We mostly did party games like Two Rooms and a Boom, World Championship Russian Roulette, until we've recently made the switch over to role-playing games with our game Mothership, the sci-fi horror role-playing game. We've been doing that for a few years now, and we're just sort of working on a new box set that will sort of codify our first edition, sort of in the tradition of Cyberpunk 2013 or Traveler or original Dungeons and Dragons. We really wanted to have that that feel that I have when I'm holding sort of those OG box sets, and that's just what we're working on day and night. I've got a 2-year-old keeping me busy, and that's about it.
You better watch out for the 2-year-old who's going to end up running a company.
Yeah.
Gets into their blood.
Sean, were you also working on a cyberpunk thing for Mothership?
Yeah, at some point we're going to expand Mothership into a cyberpunk realm. Our sort of pitch is like if Aliens and Blade Runner were in the same cinematic universe, and we're calling it Null Hack.
Cool.
So they kind of are.
They kind of are, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's a lot of interesting crossover there. All right, so we got a whole bunch of questions to get to submitted by our viewers. First, quick shout out to our sponsor for this episode. This episode is sponsored by Into the AM and their series of fantasy and sci-fi themed t-shirts. This is the one that I'm wearing right now. It reminds me a little bit of what being a DM sometimes feels like. Right now, there's a number of discounts that they have going on that you can take advantage of. For example, if you head down to the description below and click on my link, you will get 10% off their entire web store. And then from May 28th to 31st, they're also going to have a store-wide sale where everything is 20% more off. You can stack both of those discounts together. So head down to the description below, click on that link and check it out. Thanks again to Into the AM for sponsoring. And now let's get back to the show. So let's get into our questions. Our first one, I'll just pick one here, comes from Emil Bovin, who wants to know what are the biggest differences in designing a sci-fi or horror game compared to a medieval fantasy one? So my channel is mostly old school focus, so we're mostly talking about fantasy and D&D and things like that. But right. It does strike me that like sci-fi and horror has a very different approach that you have to take to game design. So either of you have any insights on that?
Well, actually, I started off playing fantasy. So in fact, I met my wife in a fantasy game. So I have to admit, fantasy has never been something that's held my interest. And that's because a lot of the inherent tropes in it, they tend to repeat unless you can find a really interesting way to use them. The closest I've ever come to it is I did a game called Castle Falkenstein, where it was probably the first steampunk game, I think about it. And that involved dwarves and elves and giant steam zeppelins. The biggest difference I see in doing sci-fi versus fantasy is that the world rules have to be very stringent. You have to basically make sure that a gun does what a gun does or whatever, that tools and weapons and things in the world are reasonably solid. You can't just sort of make a thing out of nowhere and say, oh, this was the thing a magician did. You have to make it work, because if you don't, what happens is it makes it difficult for the GM to keep his game structured, and it makes it hard for the player to keep a sense of immersion. Because if anything can happen or if things can be shifted, it's something that doesn't guide them through the experience. In fact, about the only one I've ever seen that really from the get-go got that was Star Wars. And part of that was Star Wars is pretty much a space fantasy. So even then, blasters did certain things and, so forth. Ships went certain distances and so forth. So I find that with fantasy, I don't have as many limits to the rules. I could decide to have a dragon attack a Zeppelin because I didn't have to worry about how much hydrogen was holding the Zeppelin up or how the dragon used to fire. Fantasy gives me, at least to my feeling, it gives me that sense of you have to have internal rules, but they're not the same physical rules.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the impression I get is that in a lot of sci-fi games, people are going to be more tempted to use real world rules and like apply those, or think about things like physics, like, well, bullets go this fast, because people have a sense of how things work in the real world. And then they start applying that in the game in a way that might be harder to in fantasy because it's more ungrounded.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, never play Traveler with a physics major.
Sure. Yeah.
Sean?
Yeah, so I'll echo what Mike said, and it's kind of an interesting inversion because I find that when I'm running fantasy games for players, there's more pressure on the players to say like, well, what can I do? How does it work? How does magic work? They have a lot more questions about how things work. But in a sci-fi or a cyberpunk game, you're basically like, it works the way it is now. It works the way a computer works like a computer works, a gun works like a gun works. But the opposite problem occurs, which we found, which is that the GMs in sci-fi and cyberpunk feel more pressure to get it right. And they'll say, well, I don't know how the ship works, or I don't know how the fuel works. I don't know how long it would take to get from Earth to Beetlejuice or whatever. And so we have to overcome this sense of insecurity with a lot of our wardens and GMs that they don't have to be physics majors or whatever to be able to run a good sci-fi or cyberpunk game. Whereas in a fantasy game, I think anybody, a 10-year-old can be a killer DM in an afternoon because they're only limited by their imagination. And sci-fi and cyberpunk, the trade-off is you are in some ways limited to sort of keeping a consistent, immersive, plausible reality. But the payoff is different too because it's more visceral, it's more real, and I think players can drop into it immediately and start making decisions.
Yeah, so how do you get over that hump of new DMs or GMs getting really stressed out about the details? And I mean, because one option is just to go the GURPS route and just give them actual rules for everything that you could possibly think of. So how do you handle that?
For me, we're working on our warden's guide right now. So that's a question I'm asking myself a lot. I've been through Listen Up, You Primitive Screwheads, and the Traveler books and the DMG and all the stuff, all the resources out there. And some of the conclusions I've come to are encouragement. First, they just need a lot of encouragement. You can do this. You've been playing games of imagination your entire life. You know how to do this. You know how to play and have fun with your friends. Second is you need to nail down a couple rudimentary questions. Can you move faster than light? Can you not move faster than light? How hard or soft do you want to be? Do you want to be closer to Aliens and Star Wars, or do you want to be closer to 2001, a Space Odyssey? And if we can get wardens to think in those terms of what they want for their table and what they want their game to feel like, then it's easy to just say, you know what, at the end of the day, pretend like it's the early 90s and, you have internet, but it's slow and things break and you don't need to worry about how all the tech works, just like you don't know how your phone works right now. You just know that if you dial a number, it calls the person. So you don't need to know all the ins and outs, just what a person who wanted to interact with that technology should reasonably expect?
Yeah, my feeling on it is Sean's nailed one of the big problems. And when we first started, since we kind of pioneered a couple different types of hard science genres, cyberpunk, giant robots, that sort of thing, what I learned rapidly was you have to build framing. You have to basically build a way in which the world teaches people how to operate within it. So, for example, if you look at cyberpunk, we have roles or professions. And that was because back when we started writing stuff in 2013, I was looking at the problem of how do I tell somebody, how to be a rock and roll star in this world? How do I tell somebody what a cop does? How do I tell somebody why a solo can go around and kill people with impunity? So you have to build frameworks that people can look at and go, oh, well, that's kind of like what I want to go for. In a lot of ways, what you end up doing is creating characters, and every character coming after that on 1 or 2 levels is next B of that original character structure you did. But it works. Another thing you have to do is you have to give the players investment. And the trick is you're not going to let them do everything, but you're going to give them a personal sense of investment. This is one reason why, I came up with the life path thing originally, was you got a giant robot game. Now, I know giant robot games. I watched a lot of Japanese anime, from way back, but most people don't. So anime works on certain very, very structured conventions. The young dark-haired hero is going to somehow leap into the giant robot suit and know how to pilot it and go out and kick the butt of the guy with the mask, who, etc. So Life Path was basically designed to set characters up, and you had choices, but you could also lean on the roles for the tables, and that allowed you the elements you needed to make a character that was true to that environment. The interesting part is that I wouldn't do that necessarily for a fantasy game, because the zeitgeist for how fantasy games works are already there. And this is one reason why Star Wars works, is Star Wars has almost every fantasy trope. Here's your father's magic sword. Thank you. Here's the old wizard who's going to tell you how to use it. Kid, don't put it in your face. All of these things, these tropes are basically part of the mythology. So you don't have to explain so much. But how do I explain what a solo does? And how do I explain how the world accepts the fact that they're hired killers walking around? Until, I don't know, The Mandalorian, nobody really got that joke.
Yeah, so what you said about having those tropes in place makes a lot of sense to me, because one thing I hear people complain about sci-fi a lot is that if you're running a fantasy game, most of the tropes are there already. It kind of borrows from like mythology and from like these ancient archetypes that are just like buried in the human brain. So you can just talk about, it's fantasy land. You got elves, you got dwarves, people get it really quickly. But sci-fi, because it's in the future, is so incredibly diverse in terms of the different directions you can go. Whenever you have a sci-fi universe, you have to just explain almost everything from scratch. Like, what do all the aliens look like? What kind of spaceship is this? And you get into the nitty-gritty really quickly. But it seems like both of you really have games that sort of pick a genre or tropes and then really double down on that, which I think does a lot of the legwork for DMs. Or would you say that's right?
Yeah, I would have to agree with that. We do that on purpose. I used to describe what we do at Talsorian as Macintosh gaming, which isn't as exceptional now. But back when we started old school, you got a Macintosh, you got a PC. And a PC, you had to learn things, code and stuff. It was really a breadboard thing you had to work through. But, you got your Mac and you got the mouse and click, click, click. Oh, I opened a file. My mother started on Macintosh and she taught me how to use Macintosh. So Macintosh gaming is effectively setting down all the easy baby steps. And you don't, for example, have people calculate how fast the ship goes. You say, the ship does this. And if you're here, it will do that, And it involves, I think, a lot more work in the long run, because you have to then make sure your framing elements are in the right place. And you can't do things like say, I did the Kessel run in 9 parsecs, because someone's going to go, oh, parsec that's a level of distance. What are Then the next thing you know, you're going, okay, how do I explain this? Right. Well, if you're George Lucas and you have a fantasy, you may find a way to do it. But when you're dealing with the hard science fiction, the harder it is, the more people can pick at it and ask why. How, and we get around that a lot at Tal because we do ridiculous amounts of research. People have asked, like, well, how do you explain how people get body parts integrated into their bodies and all that? Well, let's see. I have 3 friends who are paramedics. I have a bunch of friends who are doctors. When I did the wiring system, I talked to a friend's father who was a neurosurgeon, and we went through all this stuff so that we could say, yeah, we know this will work, but we're going to do the homework. And if you really want to know, we'll show you sometime, but you probably don't. Just trust me. We did the work. And then they can go ahead, feel okay about it. And every so often I'll get some guy who goes, well, yeah, but it says over here in such and such. And I'll go, oh, you're from Reddit, aren't you? And I'll be able to say at that point, well, this guy who works over here at Johns Hopkins or whatever, he said we could get away with this. So go fight with him.
Yeah, we take a very similar tactic, I think, in establishing our ground as sci-fi horror. We didn't have to open everything up to space opera and all these other sort of subgenres of sci-fi that can be very expansive. There's great systems like Stars Without Number and Traveler that sort of cover that territory very, very well. But we figured out that by like going down one niche, from all of sci-fi to sci-fi horror, a lot more genre tropes came with us. There was a much more established fiction, like with Alien and Event Horizon and sort of all 2001, even all these other films had really, really established some sort of trope that we could rely on. And it helped give us guiding principles because we could say things like, you're not going to run into aliens that you can talk to or that you have a trade negotiation with. Every encounter with an alien is going to be a terrifying new experience. And it helped us when we were designing mechanics and when we're designing rules to know which way we should turn it, which is to say, we say survive, solve, or save, pick one. And so we have this sort of mentality that picking a subgenre really helps answer a lot of questions, whereas I think you can get really tripped up. And this happens a lot in fantasy games with trying to be all things to all people. And when you're the big capital F fantasy or the big capital SF sci-fi game, you have to appeal to Star Wars, Star Trek, hard sci-fi, soft sci-fi, and really sort of account for all those things, from everything from your equipment lists to your combat mechanics. But we felt that by tying ourselves to that horror moniker, our game had more of a philosophy. It had more of a perspective on how we were going to handle those things.
Yeah, it also strikes me that both of your games have a very strong aesthetic that they're tied to. Right? When you think mothership, you think of, what does the ship in Aliens look like, or in Alien, right? There's a very clear look and a feel to that world and to what the character's going to look like. And of course, the same goes for cyberpunk. I mean, maybe when cyberpunk was first created, it wasn't as prevalent, but nowadays, at least when people think cyberpunk, there's a very clear image in their head that they can grab onto when they're running a game.
Yeah. Basically, one of the problems I've had is, like I said, with anime, for example, with cyberpunk, there wasn't anything out there yet to establish the trope. So I could say, yeah, it's kind of like Blade Runner. But then at the time when I watched Blade Runner, it was considered to be a failure and an incredibly cult film. So, it's sort of like describing some really, really real auteur kind of film out there that 12 people saw. And I happen to be one of the 12. So you can't lean on that as much as you can with a fantasy where you can, say, it's like this that you grew up with. Sometimes that gets really interesting. I mean, Sean's got a really interesting difficulty in that he's doing something that uses horror tropes, but edges through science fiction as well. And it becomes a question, I think, of what do I have to do that satisfies one convention over the other? Where, I don't have it as hard. He's got a pretty tough road. Congratulations, sir.
Thank you.
Yeah, the problem that we always saw was that we had to educate our audience first, and they had to decide they liked the education. So it's funny, you think of like Teenage from Outer Space, about the third game I wrote, and you're going, okay, this basic idea is it's wacky teenagers running around with spaceships with alien teenagers, but you had to at least know wacky teenage high school comedy first. be able to see what was then being built on it, So it became, if you didn't understand about high school drag racing after school, you weren't going to get the flying saucer drag racing joke afterwards.
Right.
So yeah, you just end up with, the difficult part of making sure that the way people will use this tool is accessible to them. And it's funny, you don't really have that problem in a video game, because in a video game, you've established all your expectations before, and the game picks you up and carries you through it. And if you don't do it right, you'll learn soon enough when you die. I'm on life number 35 because I didn't get the joke.
Great. Let's move on to another question. Sean, do you want to pick one?
I don't have the list in front of me. Oh, there's one that I love, which is what prep do you do for your home game? I think that's always a great question.
Well, it's actually interesting. For me, it's continual prep. I usually find music, at least half a dozen pictures of major characters that I can at least say, yeah, they look like this more or less with these changes. I also, a lot of times, need very, very solid props, not because the people involved can't imagine it, but it takes that extra work out of the way. For example, about 9 feet away from me, I have an incredibly complex 28 millimeter starship. I mean, this thing is huge. It's 4 feet long. And I had this built because I'm running a starship campaign right now. And all these people are on board a kind of Mandalorian-like bounty hunter ship. But what it meant was I didn't have to explain how many feet it was between the med bay and the main control deck. I could just go, yeah, take a look, man. Quit bothering me, So I use props, and I also use a lot of index cards, because what I find is your players will mess you up constantly. You're all like, yeah, I got this, and then they're going to meet the bad guy and the aliens will be here. And then they'll go, yeah, I was saying I need to get a hamburger. Where do I get a hamburger here? And they're all like, yeah, let's go get a hamburger. You're like, oh, right. So I put scenes together on index cards. And if something blows up and they're not going there, I flip the cards and go, okay, I can get them back onto the plot by, well, I've got a card there that, will work. And I'll start playing that. And then some of the index cards I keep around are kind of typical things like, yeah, they want to go get food. How many weird things can I throw at them? So I'll be a list like, they went to get food. Somebody forgot their wallet or it was stolen. They insulted somebody who was the waiter. They tripped and spilled soup on somebody. And I'll just go, okay, I'm ready. You guys wandered off, but I was ready for you. Yeah. So, yeah, I do a lot of ridiculous prep, and it's fun. My wife always kids me because I always end up, she tell them I'm doing a new game, because she'll look around, there'll be like more stuff piling up.
Do you keep track of your NPCs on index cards, or do you have a great memory for it? Okay.
Oh yeah, my first Traveler Light game, Imperial Star, which we're now 30 years later actually getting all the old crew together and playing again, cool. Which is really kind of fun. My daughter's in it, and all these old guys like us are doing OSR, and they're used to different styles. And I actually had the entire Second Empire of Man built on index cards. I still have the decks right now. Oh, wow. So, I'd go like, okay, who's in this family? Shh. What did you guys do like 9 years ago? Shh. Oh my God, you insulted him, Flip. Keep that card. So yeah, I do a lot of index cards because I can easily go through and change things up. My script isn't written down. It's basically a bunch of possibilities that I can throw together, because my players will always find a way to surprise me. I've been amazed at some of the things they come up with,
So for my prep, I'm going through a cheap materials phase. So I'm using these cheap composition notebooks.
Oh, good.
And what I'll do is I'll have like a page for each session. and I'll keep track of the role there, and then sort of building out this idea in our Warden's Guide now of teaching people how to prep, because I think it's a big fear that people have is like, well, what do I do here? And so I have stuff like, we'll start with the horror first. Like, let's generate, where's this horror from? What's the form that it takes? What are its signs and omens that that it's sort of coming? What happens when you defeat it? Does it slumber for 1,000 years, or does it infect somebody on the crew or possess somebody nearby? So we have you sort of generate that first, and then sort of teaching people to rely on their notes and to create pages in their notebook like allies and enemies. Who do they owe? Who owes them favors, and who do they owe debts to? Long-term fallout and consequences. What are things that are sort of trickling in over time, sort of coming for the players, whether they realize it or not? That's the kind of stuff that sort of worked for me. I like making maps, map making, just because I'm a graphic designer by nature. Map making and that kind of prop making really, really works for me. And I've been playing a lot online, obviously, this year. And so it's been nice to just put up the, holodeck screen and say, like, okay, this is your scan of Hound City or whatever. And so I'm really fascinated by the index card thing because I've been trying to get into it this year. Yeah, I read about Zettelkasten's, like the German index card academic system. I read that M.A.R. Barker from Empire of the Petal Throne used index cards. And that he kept them meticulously because he had all the Solyani, like all the lineage and all that sort of stuff tracked, and I was fascinated by it. My kid kept getting into it and wrecking the boxes and messing everything up, so I was like, I'll put that on hold until he's a little bit older. But the fascinating thing about index cards is that it's modular. It's reorganizable. So if you want to say, I'm going to pull this NPC and this NPC and this monster, I'm going to throw them together and that's what I need. It sort of balloons up or compacts down to what you need. And then a thing I was working on for a while was I wanted to create a big fantasy mega dungeon, but sitting down and just designing it all at once was overwhelming. So I said, I'll do a room a day, a room per index card. And so on the index card, I'll draw the map on one side, and on the other side, I'll say, 3 skeletons, and there's a fountain of blood here. And if I just did that for 10 minutes every morning, then at the end of the year, I'd have a 365 room mega dungeon. I'd have something really, really huge. And so I like that compact aspect of index cards where you can sort of bite off a little bit at a time. Do you use those as an organizational tool for your design when you're working on modules or rule sets, or do you sort of shy away from that?
No, I use it sometimes. Okay. The other trick when you have a kid running through throwing your cards everywhere, I discovered these mini like 2-ring plastic binders. Tiny index card binders. So what I do is I start off a game and I basically will punch cards ahead of time, and I'll put dividers where necessary, and they close. And so therefore, they have to go pull the whole thing apart. But if I want to and go, I need somebody from the Castleton family, click. Okay, so Caleb is down there. Corwin, I think I'll leave back to Throne World, click. Okay, but I think, what you thought was an alien was actually a pet, click. And that works really well. I also cheat a lot of times by using a thing that actually was invented by a friend of mine named Flint Dilley. It's a comic, cartoon, science fiction, game, God, Flint's probably done everything, writer. You can blame him for like a lot of Transformers and G.I. Joe. Did great stuff. But Flint taught me the idea of how you do what's called a beat chart, where you look at what are the beats that are happening throughout the adventure, and you treat it like it's a TV series. So beat charts really help because you go, okay, here's going to be the hook. I'm going to hook it up. Here's a number of ways people do hooks. And then here I'm going to have a resolution of one small thing of the hook, but then that leads to another section that will be basically a discovery section. And so you alternate between action and discovery and resolution, and you can work your way through it. And you can also kind of time what's happening. So, I've actually been incredibly lucky because I've gotten that down now to where I can pretty much time a game to end pretty much on convention level time. You have 2 hours, Mike. Okay, I can get it done. So that, I'll have a beat that is coming down just at the time we have to close, and they kill the one thing, and I flip in the next card for discovery, and I go, but then on the other side of the ship, you hear a scream. But it's over. Game's done. Come back next week. So yeah, that works out, and combined to the cards is really useful. By the way, you're a graphic designer?
Yeah, and I was reading that you were as well.
Yes. Welcome to the club.
I would be fascinated to hear more about how, because some of your layout and all that stuff is fascinating. I mean, Cyberpunk Night City is a great module. I don't know which books you did all the work on, but
I did everything up until the last 5 years. And
oh wow,
we've got a couple new guys in. I feel like at this point my design is kind of musty. It's very rooted in the 80s and 90s. And so, for example, we have a guy named Jay Gray, who does a lot of my interior, our interior design. And he just has a way of keeping it fresh. But it does help to have the background, because I can look at something and go, yeah. And if I'm not saying it doesn't feel right, I know why it doesn't feel right. I will have seen or learned something over the years, and I'll go, yeah, throw in a little bit more kerning between these two parts of the layout, because, it's too crowded. There you are.
Well, this book is...
Oh, Night City. Yeah, I spent my life doing Night City.
It's like a Bible to me, and what's fascinating about this book is it also reminds me a lot of City State of the Invincible Overlord by Judge.
Oh, yes, which is an excellent book.
And it's written like an in-universe guide. You have these data terms, right? So these are your maps, right? And they're keyed. And you've got stuff like the Hacienda. It's 4 stars. It's on page 168. This is the stuff that I'm just ripping off left and right in all my design. And it's
I steal from everybody else too.
It's just, you've got like little logos here, data term, FYI, mixing with illustrations. And that's the thing that I could say about Cyberpunk as a system that I think it does still to this day like better than any other game, is the books themselves are immersive. You don't have to have the text describe it to you. The medium is the message. As soon as you crack open Cyberpunk 2020 or Night City or whatever, you're already in the world, because you're reading a document that exists in that world.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and so that fascinates me.
Yeah. Night City was actually this bizarre brainchild, because I decided I picked up this San Francisco streets map thing. It was like, 20 pages. And I went, well, you need to do that for Night City. And at the time, one of my best friends, he also was a design major. And he said, well, I've been wanting to do some stuff with isometrics. So he sat down and designed a total isometric viewpoint of Night City. I mean, you could see down between the buildings and a whole bit like that. And then we cut it all up, and we sat down and we figured out, what was going to be in what block, where, who was going to do that. The logos are fun because I was a designer, and I specialized in doing corporate logos and things like that. And so, it'd be like, it's 2 a.m. Oh man, I need something for Arasaka. What the heck am I going to do? Well, there's kind of like the Tokugawas, so I'll steal them on from the Tokugawas. Yeah, but I don't want to do that little fiddly bit, so I'll do 3 circles. Yeah, that'll do it. And it's actually kind of, I don't know, embarrassing now, because with the advent of 2077, I'm looking at a world that people are, looking at these logos all the time. And they're showing up on clothing. They're showing up, on sides of cars. I mean, it's kind of, what? You're wearing a tattoo of that logo? And I'm going, God, if I'd known this, I would have done a good job, because this was 2:30 in the morning. I was looking the other day at the Petrochem logo, and it was showing up on something from Night City in the video game. And I went, now, why did I do it like that again? And I could not remember. I think I was trying to show going down, but I didn't know how to,
I just pretend that it's not that I did a bad job on the corporate logo. It's that the character in the universe hired a bad graphic designer.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. I'm going to use that.
I've seen
Don't
that
play
on
in
Reddit
D&D.
actually, that there's like a whole subreddit that's just cyberpunk logos now. So that's just like,
Really?
right. Yeah. It's just people like, well, what they'll do is they'll take real world logos like Burger King and they're like, what if this was like in Blade Runner? And they'll like, make it more pixelated and kind of rotate and have a slightly 80s font with it. It's kind of fun.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I love when they do. I've seen a couple of them, but not that site. I'll have to go there now. But I've seen a couple of them, and what I love is they do capture that 80s through 90s. That it's which is weird because it's retro future. It's like where we were supposed to do the future, but we didn't get the flying cars, and here we are.
Well, we managed to actually answer someone's question who wanted to know.
Okay.
He said he wanted to know if you had any advice on how to design and format RPG books. So that was interesting because I didn't know that both of you were design majors. So I guess that makes sense based on the way that your books look. Pierce wants to know, we always hear of the rule of cool in fantasy RPGs, where if the players do something not covered in the rules or even something completely against the rule in the book, the GM should let it slide for the cool factor. Do you do something similar, or is the sci-fi worlds that you're working on more grounded and realistic?
Well, it's an official rule in cyberpunk.
Okay.
Cool rules. I mean, we literally tell them, that's how this world operates. And part of that is, you're doing an entertainment. And if you're not entertaining, if you're struggling to make the thing work a certain way, the players don't have agency and they don't get as entertained. But if it's something they care about or they've made themselves, then when you take it away from them, when you move it, when you threaten it, whatever, they care. And so the rule of cool works the same way. Is that, if somebody does something really insanely, mind-bendingly stupid, unless it violates reality entirely, like you teleported somewhere, what? I'll let them get away with it. But there is a side to that, which is that no matter how cool it is, I always have a standing rule that there are consequences. So if you manage to teleport out of the way of the bullet somehow, there was somebody nearby in the bystanders who said, that guy just teleported. And now you have a whole corporation trying to figure out how you teleported. And they're now starting to follow you, always, but making it cool. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I'm with Mike here. We don't have the rule of cool as canon, but we say the only official version of Mothership that matters is the one that's happening at your table while you're playing.
Yes.
And I think that if you're online a lot, if you're part of the RPG discourse, a lot of sort of opinions get stated as sort of like, religious beliefs of like, never fudge your dice, or, the answer's not on your character sheet, or all these sort of OSR truisms that's like in my sphere that have come up a lot. But DMing and GMing, it's a craft. And at the end of the day, it's a party. Like you're throwing a party for your friends. And I think Mike King it as entertainment is really at the heart of the problem. Like the rule book doesn't care what we do. The rule book can't have a bad time. It's just a book. The game doesn't exist in that book. It exists at the table. So what matters is like how we're interacting, if we're having fun. And I think some of these pieces of advice, like let your players die if they make mistakes and don't fudge rolls, are really good starting points for you to get a sense of how you run things, but they're not the end goal. The end goal isn't to live up to like Gygax's standards from the DMG from 30 years ago. It's to develop your own internal sense of what you like and what you and your friends like at your table. And so we're approaching our Warden's Guide in a very similar way that is not, this is the way you have to do it, but this is how you can start to develop instincts about how you run games. And I think that it's a subtle difference, but it's important to me because I think a lot of times, Mike, I don't know if you've run into this. You'll hear people say, "Oh, I messed up," or "Nobody died in my game, so I must have been doing it wrong." And I'm saying, like, well, did you guys have fun? I mean, it's your life, it's your time on this earth. So if you enjoyed those 2-3 hours playing, there's no doing it wrong. There's no missing rules. And if you guys are having fun, you don't owe it to the rule book. You certainly don't owe it to me to do it the way we came up with. I mean, we get it wrong half the time.
Yeah, I agree with you. We have a saying over here at Tal, which is, once you buy the book and take it home, it's yours. You do whatever darn fool thing you want about it. And we really encourage that. And I think you're right. I mean, the joke about I killed your character, that's been kind of built during conventions because people have heard that cyberpunk is lethal, and it is. But if they actually don't tell them this, but if they actually looked at how I structure games, I almost always let them out of the situation that they don't control. But if they do something stupid and they don't pay attention, I will let them die. And that's part of it, because then when somebody says, oh, I remember once a guy like fumbled he was being really cool and he fumbled a bunch of grenades and he was wearing like about a dozen grenades and he ended up blowing himself and half the ship they were on, a boat ship, half the ship in half. But it was really cool how he did it. So nobody felt really bad, even the people who died, because it was such a stupid move. And I'm going, yeah, remember, when you're running, do not pull Mr. Pin out of Mr. Grenade next time, But you actually find that people enjoy that if they feel like they had part of that, and I love to hear what people do with the rules. They go, you're going to be mad if, I change this rule in Cyberpunk. No, dude, you bought the game. Go do something fun. Maybe I'll steal it from you, And I have seen and learned so many amazing things from players and GMs out there that every time I go to a convention, it's like, okay, so what wild, crazy thing are they going to come up with? What am I going to see when I'm, I like to kind of go over to somebody's table and they're running a Cyberpunk game and like try to be invisible and not be noticed and listen to how they're running it and go, ooh, yeah, dude, I want to get in your game,
Yeah, I've been having that experience recently. I put out an adventure called The Waking of Willoughby Hall, and it's my first like big adventure that I published, and people have been sending me session reports of what happened when they were playing the game, and it's just wild. They're all completely different from each other. People are doing stuff that I would have expected players to do, and so I'm just building this compendium on my computer of all these different session reports. And it never ceases to surprise me like what players are going to do, and like these players aren't necessarily being beholden to a particular philosophy that's in the book or online. They're just playing at home and they have their own internal, social contract on how these games are going to be run. And so much of being a good DM is developing that confidence to not feel like you're beholden to the internet. I don't know. I feel like a lot of people who are just on the RPG internet a lot feel like they're beholden to this play style or that. And they just lack the confidence to just do what their friends enjoy, in their own homes.
Yeah, I always think of the rules as like having this really, really large Yeti-like creature standing behind you. So if people get out of control in your game, you can say, Bob, stomp them. But beyond that, Bob usually is off getting a snack. He's somewhere else doing something. So you don't have to call him in from the kitchen very often. And I love looking at action reports from games too, because, and in fact, there's a convention I used to go to called Icon, where they would like file them together as all of the reports from all the games that were running at that time. And you could read this diary of like all the games they had done and what crazy things people had done. It was like a high point of going to this con sometimes. And, you're not the only creative person there. They're creative too, if you give them a way to do it. By the way, I want to see it when you finish your book. Your God.
Oh, it's finished. It's out now.
Oh, okay. Cool.
But yeah, like the thing that I sort of discovered is a lot like what you were saying. When you're creating this adventure, it's almost like a playground. I'm creating a structure. I'm putting a lot of things with high kinetic energy or high potential energy, just sort of hanging around. And then players go around just like knocking things over and things spiral out of control. And then, seeing how they react to stuff is just amazing. Let's jump over to another question. Mike, did you have any questions that you wanted to look at?
I kind of looked at the list when I first saw it and I said, oh my God, that's a lot of questions.
That's okay. I have a whole list right here.
Okay. Yeah. Pick something.
Sure. So the next one is from Thumehammer, I think you say his name. And he just says, as a longtime fantasy DM player, I am very familiar with fantasy tropes and how to run magic, but feel very naive about running science fiction-based games, especially science-heavy mechanics. what reading or viewing would you recommend that can get me up to speed on sci-fi, cyberpunk, space tropes as quickly as possible? There's a couple other questions very similar to this. I'm asking about recommended reading to really get you in the right headspace. Do you guys have particular inspirations?
Boy, there's a lot of them. Why don't you take that, Sean? I'll fake an idea when I get
Okay. I've put together a sort of appendix N type list for Mothership. We'll probably put it out as a pamphlet. I'm a big movie person, so just start in the 80s with, Cronenberg and
you are going hardcore.
And James Cameron and, the Alien franchise, Terminator franchise, get into the Matrix, all, the Blade Runner franchise, like all these big science fiction things, like fall in love with the genre a little bit and sort of take it from there. The sort of niche stuff that I'm really into right now, there's an author named Brian Evanson, who's a horror writer, and he does some great stuff. He actually wrote under the name B.K. Evanson the Dead Space novels.
Oh, yeah.
And he did an Alien novel too, called No Exit. But he's like a literary horror author, and his collection, A Collapse of Horses, I could not recommend highly enough. And it has a short story in there called The Dust, about these like space miners, and this dust starts getting into their suit, and they start seeing doppelgangers and duplicates of themselves. And that was a very, very, very core part of Mothership for me early on. And there's another good one by Alistair Reynolds called Diamond Dogs, about a group of explorers who've been hired by this shady, trillionaire benefactor to investigate this strange alien artifact on another world. And it reads like a sci-fi D&D adventure, because they have to go into this tomb-like thing and solve these like increasingly complex mathematical puzzles, which I wish you could sort of get away with in a role-playing game. In the book, it's just like, oh, the physicist solved this one. But another really good sort of deep cut for me. But at the end of the day, yeah, like just rely on the classic sci-fi films to get a sense of just the pacing and the beats, like what Mike was saying, and get that sort of into your subconscious.
Yeah, no, I agree with that, Sean. One of the things I also find is that there's a lot of science fiction. So look at the kind of game you want to do. Look at what you want your players to do. You want them, rocketing across the galaxy to places and this exploration. Do you want them to be down on their luck and they have to survive within the environment they're in? Do you want them to find, mysteries and, horrors that nobody's ever seen? Find out, first of all, what kind of activity. I mean, literally, a friend of mine came up with this idea many years ago. He said 16 words. You can sum it up in 16 words. You know what this game is about. And I've used that for years because, if the game is, battling, threatening aliens across many, many worlds, and you've got that down, you know what you're going to do. And then you turn around and you look at your library and you start looking at all the possibilities. I have a really interesting cheat with that, which is the 16 words thing. I will sometimes type what I'm thinking of doing into a search engine, and I'll just see what science fiction, I'll put book at the end of it, and I'll see what the search engine kicks up, and then I'll go read that. In fact, that's one reason I discovered a writer recently, Ian Banks, who did the Culture series, and I had never discovered that. And I was looking for AIs dominating a culture, and obviously culture, was the right keyword. And I was on vacation. I found Ian Banks. I'm like, my God! So I run out and I find like one Ian Banks novel, but out of that, I could see a world that actually answered questions that Star Trek has, and they never answered. What happens when you do have a post-scarcity culture and people do any dang fool thing they want? What do? Do they even have a federation? Do they even, if the ships are that advanced, why are they fighting? And if the ships go out and just say, hey, it's time for us to fight a war, humans go, well, shall we get together? Oh, only if you want to, man. I mean, you're all way too slow for starters. I love the culture books because he manages to ask those questions and leave you hanging in terms of what did this really mean? If I can do all this stuff in a spaceship, if I have an AI I can talk to, how long till it treats me like it's a pet, And I always look at where you want the players to do things, what options. For example, the group I have now, the original iStar game was a very, very spanning the galaxy to resurrect the first empire. And so people traveled and went places a lot, and they were primarily military or exploration. But this group now is stuck in a backwater with minimum jump gates between places. And there's political factions and pirate factions, whatever, and they're all bottled into this really narrow environment. And I basically said, this is a world where you are figuring out the puzzles of what everybody else is doing. And the closest analogy I had was, you are in 14th century Florence or something, and Machiavelli and his friends are, getting ready to do something. And whatever they do, as you get further up the chain, they start noticing that you're involved in this whole thing. So they're having a blast right now because almost everything they stumble across, they're going, okay, who gets advantage out of that? I don't know. I'm gonna do some research. I had one player spend like half her sessions going through the library, just okay, so we've got this rare metal that everyone seems to want. What does it do? And she comes back out with tons and tons of information. And about the last thing I say, oh yeah, I can build a bomb big enough to destroy a sun. Long silence. Oh crap. I'm going, and you guys have like several tons of it. Oh crap. So yeah, that would be my advice, is to some extent let the type of game you want to run inform what you're going to read. And the other part is read everything. I read everything I get my hands on, because it's all grist to the mill, and it will pop up somewhere, in what you're writing. So just read, man. Our house is wall to wall. God, I would not be able to give you panoramic. This is just within my office. There are 5, 6, 7. There are 8 bookshelves and a computer. And that's just in the area I'm working. And then there's an entire, 20 by 20 room downstairs, floor to ceiling. That's books. And then there are books out in the garage. And there's books in Talsorian. Read every time, every chance, every opportunity. Mine that stuff, because you'll find all kinds of cool things.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. That's something that I've noticed as I've done more and more interviews with RPG designers, is that behind them is always just books.
Mm-hmm.
You have to be a voracious just consumer of information, because being a game designer, especially in RPGs, you're a world designer. You have to know a little bit about everything in order to pull off a plausible world.
Yeah, there's a thing I've said a long time ago, which was basically creating a world or a game like this is, you eat a pound of dough, you eat half a pound of mozzarella, you drink some tomato sauce, you eat a whole salami, and then you throw up a pizza. In other words, you take a lot of stuff that's very disparate, and somehow you have to bring it together as something that people will want. Don't tell them where you made the pizza, though.
Yeah, I think curiosity is a GM's best friend in that regard. Being able to be sort of fascinated by anything. I have a really hard time. I have a hard time. I don't get bored very easily. Because I'm really fascinated by the people around me or what I'm reading. I've got my phone, so I've got my Kindle on there, and so I'm always just trying to pick up different stuff. And then you start to get fascinated by these things, and the game designer in me starts waking up, where I go, oh, I really do want to think about economics and trade unions and how that would affect space travel, and all those things start coming together. And you can find a way, like Mike said, like it shows up in your games without you wanting it to. So read broadly, read deeply, a lot of different topics, a lot of different subjects, watch a lot of different movies, and that's really the thing that fantasy, I think, is having a rough time with right now, is the tropes are so codified. People are having a hard time imagining what an orc would be that wouldn't be like a World of Warcraft orc. And so if you look back at that, like the pulp era with, Robert E. Howard or Michael Moorcock or Ashton Clark Smith, some of these guys' ideas are just night and day from each other, but we've all sort of dumped them into the same soup. And now fantasy comes out and it looks very samey. And so you really want to sort of get off the beaten path and follow your curiosity there.
Yeah, I agree with you. That's one reason I'm not that big on fantasy, is that, it's, from D&D onward, it's sort of been codified, and I have a hard time finding ways to stretch that. It can be a real problem sometimes because you can't move too far in a fantasy game without leaving your players behind. It takes them a long time to figure out, where do you go with that? So it's a difficult trick. And, doing horror science fiction, that's pretty darn tough.
Another thing that I just occurred to me, especially if you're doing sci-fi, a kind of counterintuitive type of book to look into is history. Because they say the past is a foreign country. When you start reading like biographies and history of cultures and people from the distant past, it is like an alien world. You start getting into the headspace of people who thought wildly differently than we think about anything today. And that can be a really big inspiration because sci-fi tends to be so much more about ideas than fantasy does. And the past is a really good place to mine that, I found.
Yeah, it's interesting that you're talking about history because, for example, my current thing is what's called the Bronze Age collapse. I never heard of this. And the Bronze Age collapse, basically all of these cultures, the Egyptians, the Minoans, and the Mycenaeans, and the Hittites, and so forth, all traded and talked to each other and sent stuff back and forth for roughly nearly 1,000 years. And then all of a sudden, it all falls apart. And there's no real sign, and you go back and the palaces are burned or torn down, and the only thing you got is one pharaoh who stopped the sea people, and you're going, man, now I could write a really interesting fantasy game out of that. And so I'm kind of mucking with it now, and I've got like 25 different books looking at this going, okay, so who could the sea people have been, and I'm thinking this would be very different than most European fantasy because it's coming from a different route. And, it fascinates me. But if I hadn't been reading, I would not have stumbled across it. It's one reason we ended up doing The Witcher was, again, I'm not that big on fantasy, but The Witcher is this weird fusion between Eastern European fantasy, which is very different, very dark and structured differently, and I guess you might call it a film noir novel. You've got this white-haired dude who wanders around and his job is killing monsters, but it's not typical. It's more like, all right.
Almost like a Western, yeah.
Yes, and somebody pointed out not too long ago to me, they said, yeah, Mandalorian is, Geralt with a spaceship. And I went, yeah, you're kind of right, But that's why it was fun. And I remember my son and my wife glommed onto this when CD was looking for somebody to write it, and they said, "Oh yeah, we're here. We are doing this." And I'm kind of like, "You're doing a fantasy thing. I don't do fantasy." And they're going, "You don't do this kind of fantasy." And it's a pretty wild world.
Absolutely. I played a little bit of The Witcher actually, of the RPG. The game that from our Talsorian.
Oh, the tabletop?
Yeah. It was only one session. It was really interesting. Mostly just because how lethal it was versus what D&D looked like. Like people's arms were getting chopped off. I'm like, oh no, I don't have an arm now. That's never happened to me before.
And the thing was that I would not have made it that lethal necessarily, but my son designed a game. And he was point blank told by CDPR, we want you to use the same mechanics as Cyberpunk. And he said, people are going to die like her. So we want you to use. Well, it turned out the CDPR crew were all fans and played Cyberpunk when they were growing up. And they were adapting the rules, I guess, into their fantasy games too, as they found them. So, he suddenly realized, if this is realistic, hardcore fantasy, then people are going to get their arms chopped off. I said, good luck with that. But did you have a good time?
Yeah, it was really interesting. It was fun to try out a new system and to really make me think differently about how I approached combat. I mean,
Mhm.
OSR games are generally pretty lethal, but once you get to higher levels, you do have a relatively high amount of hit points.
Yeah.
So it was interesting to have more detailed combat where when you
Mhm.
would hit someone, you would actually roll to see where you were injured. And then I had to
Mhm.
start taking that into consideration. That was a lot of fun.
Well, I'm really fascinated by the return of OSR in many ways because it's people think of it as it was structured and limited, but those are only the walls, and you could do anything within the room.
Hmm.
So, there are rules where you could go, yeah, it says we move down the corridor X number of paces, but I don't have to follow that one. But, that their rooms are occupied like this. Yeah, I'll buy that. And the problem was people did much the same thing as they do in fantasy, which is that they took it all. They just said, yeah, I've got to do it, the entire rule set the way it is.
Hmm.
And now I think, people who are bringing back that Renaissance are going, yeah, there was some cool stuff. I don't have to do all of it. But, these 24 things were just awesome. And I've got to use them.
Yeah, there's
That's what
really
attracted me to it.
Yeah, yeah. There's a couple
Yeah.
different like schools of thought. Like there's a whole OSR that's just people who are playing AD&D by the book exactly, and there's a whole different one where it's taking inspiration from the play style. So
Mm-hmm.
it's not really one movement even.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. I think we have time for one more question. There's a whole bunch of questions just about cyberpunk, especially playing those types of games today. So someone called Don't Normally asks, I think a lot of what is called cyberpunk, lowercase c, seems to be missing the punk these days.
I
Do you agree?
knew
And what are your thoughts
that
on
was
that
going to get.
observation?
I knew that was going to get asked. And you know what the funny part was? I wrote down a style and movement characterized by the adoption of aggressively unconventional, often bizarre or shocking clothing, hairstyles, makeup, behavior, and the defiance of social norms of behavior, usually associated with punk rock musicians and fans. So, yeah, I knew this question was going to come up. But what I find really interesting about it is I think there's aesthetic punk or aesthetic cyber, and then there is more the kind of real. And what I think when I look at it is there's not a lot of rebellion going on in a lot of the cyberpunk stuff. People are not stopping and going, this world sucks. It's a craptastic world, and I've got to go fix something. And they're not thinking, like, well, how do I screw over this corporation so I get mine? They're instead either seeing it as an enormous crusade, or they're the downtrodden and can't do anything about it. And I think that gets away with the problem, or the punk part of cyberpunk that was fun was, these characters were characters who were in the face of the powers that be. And they may not have, they didn't waste time protesting. They said, I'm going to burn this place down, or I'm going to, hack their system and crash it, or I'm going to do something. And it was always, an active agency laden thing. And that's the spirit of punk. The spirit of punk is, one of my personal favorites is Wrath the Casbah because it's mocking an entire, way of looking at war. Um, that's tough to do though, because you have to really kind of think that way as well. You have to think, yeah, what am I going to do here that isn't saving the world, but still kind of gets in the face of the world and, lets me get away with things, but I have no illusions I'm going to go, play Superman and run around and save everything, but I can screw around with things enough to where I get mine and the people around me, and maybe I get this guy off my back, and maybe the man is thrown back a little bit further, and the whole time I'm like, yelling in his face, So that's me and punk. But I knew that question was going to come up.
Yeah, I think cyberpunk is having a really interesting moment right now as we didn't get the flying cars like Mike said, but we did get pretty much everything cyberpunk promised us we would get. Overbearing corporations and the obsessive government tracking and the limiting of rights and even all the stuff about right to repair and all this sort of stuff keeps coming up. So I think it's not a sort of dystopic premonition anymore. It's a present reality, and I think for gaming, like having a safe way to engage with that is I mean, it's fun and it's totally great, and I'm sure there's going to be people who are not going to want to have to deal with that stuff in their game today, and that's totally fine. But I think um, as a genre, I think cyberpunk has a lot of life left and a lot of areas to grow. Not just in the aesthetic component, which I think is changing in a lot of ways, from like the black and neon to the bright pastels, that we're seeing a lot now.
What's
But
behind
also,
me right now? Yeah.
right, exactly, yeah. To more of the questions about like, okay, so um, in the face of overwhelming oppression, what can you do? Maybe you can't, like Mike said, change the entire system, but there are probably marginalized and downtrodden people in your neighborhood within your arm's reach, and they need um, medicine that's being hoarded by the local gang who's under contract by the mega corporation to steal the supply to drive up stock prices or whatever, right? um, and somebody's grandmother, somebody's mother needs that medication. And I think cyberpunk is a great way of being local, and not having to be epic and world ending, but being very much about that, very all the way back to one of the first things you said, that buy-in and that investment.
Mm-hmm.
um, is really keying people in to their community, right? If you look at sort of the protests in Hong Kong, I think
Oh
you're
yeah.
seeing people who are standing up for their neighbors and standing up for their block and standing up for their neighborhood. And I think that is very much like a relevant thing, both in gaming, but in the world. And I think there's a lot of play there, to explore that world of, we just got a house, our first house, in November, and we're getting to know our neighbors. We have a Croatian immigrant next door. We have an old lesbian couple across the street. And these people have been here for much longer than us, and we're getting the sense of all the drama and community and the history of the neighborhood, right? And if you start thinking about what would happen if this little microcosm, this little tiny community was threatened,
Mm-hmm.
what would you do to help your neighbors? And that's something that I'm deeply fascinated by. And I think even aesthetically, as technology passes far beyond, what probably Mike was envisioning when he first wrote the game,
Yeah.
the themes will still be very, very relevant.
Yeah. I'm really with that, Sean, because, for example, one of the first and normally the typical adventure that I set up for new players is called The Apartment. And it's dealing with homelessness facing you right in the street. You have a nice apartment, you've got it all set up, you're living with a bunch of people, and you're in this building. And then some mega corporation decides they're going to tear down your building so they can put in a microwave tower. And they're not going to ask you, and they're going to use all the legal and other nasty things that they can to essentially brush you aside like you don't count. They're not even going to bother all that much to set you up in a new situation. And you live in a world where, finding housing is ridiculous. And just dropping people into that reframes it for them, because suddenly that homeless guy down the street is not an abstraction. Your character is facing the same dang thing, and you're figuring, well, how do I keep my home? How do I keep somebody who's immensely powerful, has more lawyers and all that? And the only difference now is that, well, I've got a lot of weapons and a lot of unhappy people and cyberware. So I'm a little harder, when they send thugs finally to throw me out. When I did The Apartment, I was thinking obviously in America, but I was also reading at that point an article or two about in Japan where the Yakuza would like come in and clear out a block for sale, so to speak, and realizing, my God, this really does go down, and seeing that same kind of urban renewal in neighborhoods I'd lived in or lived around where, no, they did not send in armed gangers, But, suddenly they found that some corporation had, bought all of the land out from underneath them, and they were moving. And the corporation didn't really want to be bothered with replacing them or, dealing with them fairly. So the thing about it is that you can't really just send a group of people in to be nice about that. You have to go to a more of a punk mentality of, okay, guys, so here's the deal. You just decided to tear down where I live, and I've just hacked into your system, and I am now going to essentially blackmail you by locking down your system until you move away from where I am. And, that's something that one person could do.
Mm-hmm.
Or you're sending the police. Well, yes, and we're going to mine the area, and we're going to tell the cops, yeah, you don't want to come near me, Or, you don't want to be here because if you do, we'll spread, something horrible like, rat poison or whatever all over it. Basically, small acts of rebellion against much more powerful forces. And that's a very punk thing.
I read a thing about cosmic horror and Lovecraft, and they were talking about, why would you ever play Call of Cthulhu if everybody gets insane? Oh, me too. And why would you ever play that game? Because everybody goes crazy. And they say, the thing I read said, Call of Cthulhu is about depression in that it's not about defeating the darkness. It's about keeping the darkness back for another day. And I think cyberpunk is like cosmic horror in that way, where you don't really defeat the corporations, but you get another day, you get by another day, you make life better for the people around you. And the apartment's like a great example of that. Like you don't win, but you get to keep your space, and that's enough for today. But there's always more struggle and more work.
Mm-hmm. And I'm always fascinated by every time I run the apartment, the players come up with another way to do it. That just intrigues the heck out of me. Last time I did one for one of the magazines, and it was fascinating because they figured out they were essentially going to hold a concert and get all the various gangs to support the concert in the middle of their street. So it suddenly became, you don't really want to send your people in here right now because 4 of the nastiest gangs are partying right in the middle of the street, and they plan to party for a long time. And as long as you keep showing up, we're going to keep rolling out beer. Or smash, and sort of like, yeah, well, we found a way to block you. Now I said, God, that was brilliant. No guns, no, disaster. Just, we're throwing a perpetual party, and you're never getting that steamroller in here, baby. You're never getting that crane down this block. I wouldn't even try it because, you'll honk off the bozos, and you don't want to honk off the bozos.
That's another thing that strikes me that like the whole cyberpunk genre has in common with things like the OSR. Where so much of the setup is you're up against forces that are way bigger than you, or things that you probably shouldn't fight directly, but then that engages a part of your brain that turns the problem solving mode on. And people get really creative, and they start thinking laterally, and they come up with solutions that are way more creative than, we just get enough magic items and we all just attack them.
Yeah, I'm really down with that because, the thing about OSR people miss was there were things you were not going to be ready to tackle. And nobody got up in the morning and said, I'm 3rd level. I think I'll take on Tiamat now. There was no balanced, like, your campaign is only for 3rd levels. It was, Tiamat's out there. Are you stupid enough to do this? And that was kind of great because it meant, I have to grow and get bigger and badass to be able to tackle these bigger threats. And I don't feel like I'm being taken through a Disneyland tour. And Cyberpunk's combat system, as lethal as it is, it's based off of, for the most part, real weapons. I sat down, for example, and looked at the damage tables and throw rates of just about every bullet in that place. And then I got a couple of friends of mine who were actually military paramedics and said, so if I shoot somebody here, what happens? And they're going, oh God, don't remind me. So basically it's that way. And it's deadly because I want people to not go, hey, I'm a hero and a bullet sponge, no problem. I want them to go in and go, oh, God, I took a shot in the belly and I'm out of this. I probably don't want to run in again without ammo and armor and an AV4.
Awesome. All right. I think that's a perfect place to end this. Thanks to Sean and Mike for joining me. This was a lot of fun. I think we hit a lot of these questions, got a lot of great answers.
Mike, I had a quick question.
Sure.
I searched for this online and I couldn't find the answer anywhere. The best I found was a rumor. Talsorian, the name of your company, is that the name of some friend's father who gave you a loan to start the company?
Like 35 years. God. Okay. Short and dirty of it. When we were first starting to put this company together and we actually said, oh my God, we have a game company. I was going to originally name it Bonzo Fury Games. And I was going to name it after an angry chimpanzee. And everyone looked at me and said, no, you're out of your mind. That's not happening. So I was at a convention. We still hadn't gotten a name yet. And Warren Spector, who was at that point working for Steve Jackson, was in the booth next to us. And we all got to talking because, you know, it was fun. And he said at one point, whatever you do, don't name it after yourself. You know, he was obviously teasing about Steve. So, who was a hero of mine. So I said, okay, I can't do that. And I'm sitting around there. I go, I got to name this after somebody. I said, okay, who's the one person who will never show up at a convention? You know, and a friend of mine had talked his father into basically contributing money to do this. And we were a subchapter S corporation, I think it was, which was if you invested and the company lost money, you could take it off your taxes. Very useful. And so he talked his dad into this. And his dad was like, you know, a farmer, a raisin farmer down south in Fresno. And we figured he'd never show up, ever. You know, why would he go to a convention? You know, so we thought, okay, we'll name after him, but we'll call it RTG, you know, because no one calls these companies by their full name, you know. So instead of Ross Talsorian, you know, it was kind of like, okay, it'll be RTG and no one will ever use that name. They'll always call it RTG, just like TSR is Tactical Studies Research.
Right.
And FASA was Freedonian Aerospace Administration and so forth. Game Designers Workshop, you know. So I didn't think anybody ever do anything with it. And people got interested. And eventually at one Origins, he actually did come out. But, you know, we got him a different badge. And we had him, he wandered around, kind of went, yeah, he told me this is a weird business. By the way, you were supposed to lose money your first year. And I said, I'm sorry, you know.
We tried.
Yeah, we tried. We tried to lose money. We did not.
It conjures up the Tyrell Corporation from Blade Runner in my head. It's like Talsorian, what a regal, you know, epic name.
It's a fine Armenian name. Oh gosh. At any rate, yeah, I have never. We call it Tal back where, you know, it's Talers RTG. That's and great. Everybody does that because, you know, we're kind of, I don't know, slightly embarrassed maybe. I don't know. It seems silly. But
that's,
you know,
all good company names are silly like that, I think.
I still think Freedonian Aerospace Administration is one of the best.
I like Bonzo Fury. That's more my speed.
I have thought about that. I would love that. I was going to get a manic cybered up monkey banging the cymbals together.
Oh, man.
And the slogan's going to be wrapped around it. Said, break those Bonzo Fury. It was kind of a punk logo for a punk time. But no, I got voted down.
Mike, it was really great to meet you. You're a personal hero of mine. So it was awesome getting to talk to you this time. Ben, thanks for setting it up.
You should send some, you know, email and we'll get in touch.
Yeah, that sounds great.
I want to read the guide you're putting together.
I will. I'll send you the drafts and stuff. Yeah.
I have been thinking about doing a new version of Listen Up, You Primitive Screwheads.
You should.
Just learned a lot of things in the last.
And your index card stuff and your beat stuff. That's all. I think sometimes we start designing products and we design what we think people want. And we want it to sound official like a game, but really they want the dirt. Like, what do you do? What are the nuts and bolts to make it fun? Because you know, you're a great GM and I think that stuff's really helpful to people. Yeah,
it really is. And I've stolen half of what I know in GM from other people I think who are way better than I was. But, you know, that's the thing I loved about getting into this industry was everybody likes to muck about with everybody else. And as you probably seen at the end of conventions, people are going on trading stuff back and forth, like,
Yeah.
Hey, yeah, I saw Orion around your booth. What do you got? Oh, yeah. Okay. Well, I want that Lord of the Rings product over there. Okay. And you're swapping stuff right and left. And we all go home with these piles of everybody else's games.
Oh, yeah.
And go, oh, I'm just going to have a hell of a good time. I mean, I'm sitting there right now, I just did something like that. And I'm sitting here with like tons of this company. I can't show it, but at any rate, there's a company called Gamelin. And I just like have like all of their games because I stumbled on them at a convention. I went, this is really cool for something the size of a paperback book, and that's the fun part is you start learning what other people are doing and you really love it,
Absolutely.
So yeah, you should, well, I'm pretty sure that, that Ben's got my email and stuff like that. But
I'll shoot your guy an email and let him know.
I have the email of your social media guy.
Yeah, you're probably talking to Jay, I would guess.
Yeah.
Well, it's got set up. So yeah, Jay, I'll hook you up. We'll talk some more.
That sounds great, Mike. Awesome.
Yeah, let's do that, man.
Ben, fun. Thanks so much, man.
Hey, you're welcome. This was a lot of fun. That's the best part about like Questing Beasts is just like getting people together who would never get to talk otherwise.
Yeah,
absolutely.
No, this is fun. If I get some time, I might do it again. I enjoy it.
Well, it's been great having you guys.
Have a great night, guys.
Take care.